tell me about this conference in Cuba, which interests me for multiple reasons, including the whole concept of international solidarity, but also Cuba, a place I've wanted to visit for a very long time. So, what was the conference?
This was called the Sixth Conference on World Balance, or Equilibrio del Mundo, and they do it every 2 years in Havana. So they've been doing it for 12 years because this was the sixth one. And it's organized as anything in Cuba with the Cuban government, but also with all kinds of organizations from around the world, including World Beyond War. And there were people there from, the majority of nations on earth. Like the blockade is cutting off products, but it's not cutting off people. And I met, members of parliaments, leaders of political parties from around the world, and activists on peace, but on all kinds of issues from around the world, who are there, as a global gathering to share and do panel discussions and meet each other, but also in solidarity with Cuba and in agreement with the Cuban government and the Cuban people against the embargo, the blockade, the sanctions, the threats, the theft of land ongoing at Guantanamo, the disgusting uses and
Yeah.
proposals for new uses at Guantanamo, and all the rest of it. So, and the president of Cuba, is a participant like anybody else, comes into your panel discussion. It's very interesting. And of course, there are going to be lots of things I disagree with the Cuban government about in terms of their domestic policies. And,
Mhm.
I've got all these photos on social media with the president of Cuba. I'm not endorsing, everything he's ever done, but in opposing these illegal, immoral, brutal sanctions and blockade, punishing any other country that does trade with Cuba, the lies about Cuba, the putting Cuba on a list of supporters of terrorism when they don't support terrorism. I agree with Cuba on this. It's got to end.
Right, and it's really important that it used to be, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I have the impression that it used to be understood, at least in certain political circles, that diplomacy is a good thing, that you don't just talk to people who have your unconditional approval, that diplomatic overtures to a country like Cuba, which is 90 miles off our coast, is just a good idea. They're doing some good things, they're doing some bad things, but instead, sanctions are really a kind of they strike me as anti-civilian warfare that ordinary Americans don't have to think they don't have to feel guilty about. But it's warfare, isn't it? A leading
Uh,
question, I know, but
I mean, as someone who opposes war, meaning the mass killing and destruction with weapons of people and places, I have a certain resistance to, the war on drugs and the war on
sure.
poverty and the culture war and the war on Christmas and all this, because it's so hard to get anybody to oppose actual war. But sanctions are deadly. They are
Right,
cruel. They are
right.
illegal. They are a violation of the Geneva Conventions. I mean, here is a country that doesn't have poisons that are thought of as resources, doesn't have oil, gas, coal, lithium, minerals, right? It's just an island. It's like, imagine the Florida Keys trying to survive if they cut the bridge to Miami, right? It's just an
Right.
island, doesn't have anything. And yet it's surviving. It's making its own food, it's creating its own products, and it's trading as best it can with nations that are willing to take risks to trade with it. But it's suffering. The people are poor. The people are hungry, and it's just out of spite and cruelty, right? The United States government has this list of state sponsors of terrorism, right? And you don't need to take an argument to court. You don't even need to make an argument. It's just the whims of presidents, right? Biden took it off in his final hours and Trump put it back on. But Cuba doesn't sponsor terrorism, right?
Right.
There are people, the United States, US citizens, the United States wants to indict for US crimes, or has indicted, wants to prosecute for US crimes. that are in Cuba, and Cuba won't extradite them. That has nothing to do with international terrorism. There's the mythical Havana syndrome, right? Which,
Right,
as
right.
far as we can tell, amounts to employees of the CIA being so scared and so paranoid that they've developed psychosomatic symptoms. Right. And, I was just in Havana. I feel fine. Right. This is not legitimate international terrorism. As far as we can tell, it's imaginary, right? They've added it to their museums. In Havana, they have museums about all the biowarfare and goofy assassination attempts and all the
The
U.S.
poisoned
guns.
cigars for Fidel Castro, all that stuff.
Yeah, all of it. They've added that. They've added the Havana syndrome to the museums.
Oh,
So
really? Uh-huh. Well,
it's
it's ironic in a sense, and again, I don't agree with everything the Cuban government does either, but the putting them on a terrorist watch list when historically terrorism has been conducted against them since 1962 or so from this country, and you're blowing up of airliners, and I don't have the list at the top of my head, but there have been a series of covert Bay of Pigs. I mean, I don't know what you call that. I guess that's a attempted insurrection with U.S. support, but it seems to me it's the pot calling the kettle black, if anything.
For sure. I mean, I would argue there's been some both ways,
Hmm.
but there hasn't been much either way in many years, other than the cruel sanctions and the lies and the threats. And I think it goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Hmm.
Because remember, the U.S. government wanted Cuba to be part of the U.S. of the United States of America. First, it wanted Spain to keep it. Never mind the hypocrisy with the Monroe Doctrine and we're for independence. They wanted Spain to keep it. And when Spain couldn't keep it, they wanted it for themselves. And they wanted to be welcomed with chocolate and flowers. They wanted to take over Cuba and be thanked with gratitude. And Cuba, like most places, resisted and successfully resisted. And so the US government has always thought Cuba should be part of the United States, and, Cuba wasn't interested. Cuba just wanted to be friends, and the US government doesn't do friends, right? So then Cuba turns to the Soviet Union. Well, this is being spurned for your rival, and Cuba puts Soviet missiles on land that should belong to the US government. Uh, and the US government is traumatized by it, traumatized to this day. I think suffering PTSD, even though it's a fictional character, Uncle Sam, it's a government isn't a person. It's still imagined by the persons who make it up as suffering PTSD from the Cuban Missile Crisis, to the point where it recreates the cycle, as victims do, creates the Cuban Missile Crisis in Eastern Europe in reverse,
Hmm.
oblivious to what it's doing, right?
Right.
Oblivious to the notion that Russians could care that there are missile sites being put on its border that can utilize nuclear missiles. And so it's this long history, this long memory of this fictional character called Uncle Sam that has them punishing Cuba without any reason, without any evidence, without, when they loosened things under Obama, some of which are still loosened when Biden took Cuba off the list for a minute, like nothing bad happened, right? But they just want to punish Cuba.
In terms of peacemaking, and maybe this is a little bit of non sequitur. If so, I apologize. But in terms of peacemaking, I've thought a lot about the Biden administration's handling of Ukraine versus in the inverse situation you mentioned, the Kennedy administration's handling of the Bay of Pigs crisis. I don't idealize any president, but Kennedy, when confronted with this showdown, potentially nuclear showdown, at least had the common sense to pull his missiles back, our missiles back from Turkey. Uh, and yet, it seemed to me that well, actually, for about 8 years, the Trump and then Biden administrations were adamant about doing the opposite, putting their missiles in a border country with Russia, and then acting surprised. I'm not defending Putin. He's guilty of war crimes, but then acting surprised when he does what he threatened. And I've often wondered if we had the modern bipartisan culture of diplomacy then in 1962 that we have now, would we have wound up with a nuclear war?
I think it's very, very likely. The Russian ambassador has a fancy house about 100 yards from the White House. Like even Biden could have made it over there. I went over there and had lunch with the Russian ambassador with a bunch of peaceniks because nobody else would talk to him. He gave up and left, went back to Russia because no one would speak with him. End of diplomacy. This is the same house where they snuck Bobby Kennedy in the back door to make peace and end the Cuban Missile Crisis in secret. We're going to take our missiles out of Turkey and Italy, but you cannot tell anyone, Mr. Khrushchev. And what Kennedy did, admirable, good job. He almost destroyed life on Earth out of his own stupid machismo, and he backed off and ended it and fixed it. But what he said, not as admirable. He said to the US public and the world, I thumped my chest and acted tough, and those stupid, weak Soviets backed down. And to this day, that's what people in the United States think happened. They don't know that he took missiles out of Italy and Turkey. They think he acted tough. This is probably what Donald Trump and Marco Rubio think happened because Kennedy didn't believe he could tell the US public the truth. He thought he had to lie and act macho. And that propagate, but he knew what happened, right? And he started taking steps for the better. And he gave a speech at American University less than 6 months before they killed him, where he said, we need peace. We need to end war. We need to abolish nuclear weapons and all weapons. We need to eliminate militaries from the face of the earth. We need a hotline set up between the White House and Moscow. We need to have a treaty for no nuclear tests. And I'm going to unilaterally cease nuclear tests in the atmosphere and see what Khrushchev does. And Khrushchev followed suit, and they created the treaty, except for underground, and they set up the hotline, and they started taking steps toward peace. So, Kennedy took steps toward war. He took steps toward peace. But the steps toward peace were remarkable, were unprecedented, and were unacceptable to many in Washington, including quite possibly, and in the opinion of the majority of the U.S. public, to the people who killed him.
Yeah, and that's, Kennedy, of course, and again, neither of us is turning Kennedy into a saint, but Kennedy also said, never negotiate out of fear, but never fear to negotiate. And yet, what I've found to be here in Washington, D.C., see, I have my synthetic Washington Monument behind me. What I found here is that Republican, Democratic, when it comes to Russia is not the Soviet Union, but it's still the other biggest nuclear superpower, as far as I know, that when it comes to negotiating with Putin before the invasion, after the invasion, that means you're Putin's puppet, as opposed to somebody, I've read the 1960, 1964 Democratic Party platforms. They talk full of praise about the need for diplomacy and how we'll emphasize diplomacy, not in the 2000 or 2000, I'm sorry, not in the 2020 or 2024 platforms. And the Soviet Union, it was delusional what we did about Cuba in the 1960s, amplifying the threat from the Soviet Union. But surely, even in that mindset, the Soviet Union, they could convince themselves was a bigger threat, right? It was much larger than it is now. It had the Warsaw Pact countries. It, in their thinking, had a competing ideology that was antithetical to everything we believe in. I think that's overkill. I don't necessarily buy that. But they're doing it now when I don't know if Putin even trades with Cuba. Maybe he does, but it just seems to me that they're not part of an ideological opposing force, even though they're socialist. But I don't even get. It almost seems like a phantom limb that's still hurting or something. I don't know. Help me out here.
Well, one answer often is to follow the money, right? There is
Mhm.
huge much money to be made from weapons. It is one of the biggest and most corrupt businesses and most interlocked with governments and other industries, including media. And it makes big bucks off exaggerating the Soviet and now the Russian threat. The terrorists in the Middle East never quite did it. China doesn't quite do it. It has to be the Russians. I mean, how many times did they lie and trick the Russians in expanding NATO and pretending they were considering adding Russia to NATO, even though adding Russia to NATO would eliminate the basis for having NATO at all? But this is what the Russians wanted for decades. Why don't you just add us in? This was, the global conspiracy that right wingers in the United States were afraid of, that, all the big countries would be together in something. But it would have eliminated the basis for NATO and the basis for the weapons buildup in the United States to not have Russia as the enemy. It was needed as the enemy. And you can't talk to the enemy. I agree with you. The enemy is exactly who you talk with. And talking with someone doesn't mean endorsing everything they've ever done in their life. If that were true, I couldn't talk with anybody, even myself, right? But I remember choosing not to go on a trip to Russia once with my friend Jill Stein. And then there was this photo of her at the same table with Putin without any interpreters. She doesn't speak a word of Russian. He doesn't speak English. Like, they didn't say a word to each other, but it was like demonizing her for endless years for having been at a table with this guy. I think you have to figure out how to avoid destroying all life on Earth. And the doomsday clock people laid out the argument for how we've gotten dramatically closer to it. And then they only moved their stupid clock 1 second for some bizarre reason. But, George H.W. Bush also unilaterally took nukes out of Europe, see what the Soviets will do, and the Russians will do, and they followed suit, right? And at this point, with trust abolished, I mean, this is the only form of negotiation that's going to work, is to take a step that has no downside, that doesn't risk anything. The stuff is useless, right? The whole argument for having nukes is to pretend you're going to use something in order not to use it. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. There's no evidence it deters anything. India and Pakistan got nukes, then they went to war over it, right? So you take steps. You eliminate some and ask the other guy to eliminate some. And there's no possibility of lying anymore. The surveillance technology has exceeded the nuclear technology. You can't hide the stuff anymore, right? So just start disarming. And Trump, on this video call to Davos, said he was all for eliminating nukes with Russia and China, and they were going to do it, and it's a waste of money and get rid of the things. But then in his next speech, he's all for murdering as many people as possible. You don't know what the guy's going to do. But that was the right thing to do, is to start getting rid of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And instead, and part of that, I think, is having the mindset to do that means also having the mindset to say, Cuba's not a threat to us. Why are we bothering? And instead, I mean, it's tiny compared to us. It's crazy. It's like invading Grenada like Reagan did.
It's smaller than New York City, I think, in population.
Yeah, I imagined, and a lot of it's mountain, a lot of it's, not, but to me, I wonder how this ties in with Trump's declaration that he wants to send what he calls illegal immigrants, uh, to Guantanamo Bay. To me, it's almost as if saying, I hate all he is, and you can all rot there together. That seems to be the mindset. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of his general odious policy, right? Of wanting to demonize a chunk of the population, direct blame to them that should be directed to the government and the oligarchs, which something Russia and the United States increasingly have in common. And yet it's particularly egregious, I think, because the purpose of doing things on Guantanamo is not just to maintain the oldest and most obnoxious military base of the United States outside of the United States, but to establish publicly a ground for illegal activities, right? This is not in the United States subject to US laws that supposedly, under this interpretation, only apply in the United States. And it's not a secret black site in Lithuania that you don't tell anybody exists. It's a public site where you rename everything. Instead of a criminal suspect, it's a person of interest, or it's I don't remember all the terminology they've invented, but you create this new standard that's outside the law. And so that they've tortured people to death. They've experimented on people. They've locked people up for decades without charge or trial, right? This is what Guantanamo is. And now they've already started sending people not to the detainee. This another name they give these people, detainees, tent camp on the western side of the bay, but to the prison that they have on the eastern side of the bay. They've already started putting people there. People who haven't, as far as we can tell, been charged or convicted of any crime are being put in a prison outside the United States, because you can't put them in a prison in the United States yet, until the evil policies get imported, as they eventually do if we don't get in the way. And so you're locking people up, and they aren't even telling us, right? We have US media outlets finding out what the US government is doing by looking at satellite footage of planes going into Guantanamo, just as we find out what wars the United States is waging abroad. They aren't even telling us, right? So it's a claim to the ability to act in secret outside the rule of law, and to scare people by demonizing the victims.
Yeah, we've always, the right for a long time had this mythology of this sort of paranoid fantasy of black helicopters and black jets taking people here. We're the black helicopters now, right? That's
Yes.
what's, in effect, metaphorically, that's what it means when we send these people to
And
Guantanamo.
literally flying the black helicopters into airplanes over that river behind you.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, my daughter, a friend of my daughter's, was on the airliner, so it's terrible, But so okay, so here we have a good grasp of the problem, let's say, but we're always struggling with where to go from here. And you, as I say, you were at this conference with people from all around the world, and one of the sponsors I saw was UNESCO, that an organization that used to have political respect in this country, but then the UN itself has been cast aside as an inconvenience to some of our military ambitions. But did you get any sense that there were any openings for global activism against this stuff, and that it could be something useful?
I think there are openings. February 23rd, back in 1900 something, was the day that the US claimed Guantanamo. And it's a day that's come out of these conferences over the years that there is opposition, resistance, protest to US empire and US bases across Latin America. And this year, people are going to do it across the globe, are going to go and protest and disrupt and educate about and hold events in opposition to and make lobby visits trying to shut down military bases all over the world. So people can go to day2closebases.org and find the nearest event or create one. It's very easy. We give you the talking points, the graphics, the press release, everything you need. Take a few people and a banner and go protest the nearest military base, because it's part of the growing spending on war and preparations for war that's tearing the world down. You now have the head of NATO literally telling the European Parliament, take your money out of healthcare and
Right.
retirement, put it into war. This is what we have to oppose. There's also, I think, a big opportunity in the United States every time you put a Republican's derriere on the throne instead of a Democrat's, you get states and cities willing to take action that they otherwise won't. It depends on the flavor of the emperor, but you got Democratic Party members running cities across this country and states. This week, the state of Virginia passed through one of two houses a ban on sending the National Guard from Virginia to any of these illegal wars around the world. States can do that across the United States, and many of them will now that there's a Republican on the throne. You can get cities to pass resolutions and to take actions to convert local industries to peaceful ones, to tell the Congress to move the money to peaceful things and not more of it into the military, to ban the militarization of local police with cast-off military weapons. And they'll do it now because the president's a Republican. So, there are always opportunities to act, even in, the ugliest of times.
And it seems to me what you just said is kind of a through line to the conference too, and to visiting Cuba, which is, it strikes me that people on the left need to be more open to tactical partnerships. That, for example, Rand Paul has expressed skepticism about some of this military stuff. There's a lot of vehemently disagree with Rand Paul about great, let's team up on that. Bernie Sanders has done bills with Mike Lee, who's one of the most far right senators. Okay, great. And internationally, if it means Cuba, if it means other countries that we may have our differences about, uh, fine. And to me, it just reminds me, by the way, of I forget the name of the libertarian who runs the great anti-war website. He passed away, but I'm not, what I remember about him, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name, is that he would send me hate mail when I wrote about economic issues. You're out of your effing mind. But when I wrote about peace, about descaling the military, he would print my stuff. And to me, that's what you do. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I think the left has got to be a little less purist when it comes to things like saving humanity, for example.
I mean, as we've already been talking about, I think you have to be willing to work with people you agree with on something without needing to agree with them on everything, or, being afraid to be seen with them because you disagree with them strongly on something else. I get news from antiwar.com all the time. They do a great job on many things. Their editor over now, Scott Horton, has this book called Provoked. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, have him on to talk about it. I ignore the 5 or 10% of it that's about economics. I think it's literally insane. I can't imagine anything stupider. And yet it's 95% of the book is brilliant and totally documented, every I dotted and T crossed, and it's very, very well done. I do think, people like Ron Paul are going to get very, very upset if U.S. troops are sent to any of these wars. And the U.S. public in general and the U.S. corporate media is going to get very, very upset if U.S. troops go to a war in Gaza or Ukraine or anywhere else, if that particular type of human starts dying in one of these wars. You're going to see an opportunity for outrage that has no moral justification whatsoever. People dying is people dying to me. But if this type of people starts dying, you're going to see an opportunity for a massive movement. And I think right now, with the shift going to ethnic cleansing, with the shift going to starving the people out, we need to be investing in building these coalitions and alliances, and in supporting, in particular, the Gaza flotilla and the idea of getting aid into Gaza and getting governments not only to stop blocking the ships, but to start sending the ships. The governments that claim Israel is committing genocide, governments that claim ethnic cleansing, it violates the law and their principles, they should be assisting the Gaza flotilla. They should be providing, an entire fleet to accompany the Gaza flotilla, because a public, planned, executed ethnic cleansing by starvation is different from a lot of the wars we've protested and tried to halt, and
Mhm.
we have to figure out different solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And those countries, that handful of countries that just banded together to take action. I know South Africa's one, Bolivia's one. That would be a good place. They got to have boats, right? I mean,
They do.
and all right, so we're going to have a lot to do in the next few weeks, months, and years. But we'll stay in touch about it, and most of all, to me, it's we got to keep our courage. Not be afraid to do what's right, uh, even though there may be, yeah, they may get rough. Okay, but to do what's right, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Be like the president of Mexico. Tell Trump what's what and don't hold back. And because otherwise, we're defeated by our own fear and paranoia.
Right, exactly. We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.